Hello everyone, welcome back to Ancient Greece and Rome. This video will cover Unit 2, the First Greeks and Bronze and Dark Age Greece. In this video, we'll discuss some of the major Bronze Age Greek civilizations. We'll discuss the origins of the people that would become the Greek Bronze Age civilizations. Then we'll discuss some of the important characteristics of the Greek Bronze Age civilizations, like the Cycladic civilization, the Minoan civilization, and the Mycenaean civilization. We'll discuss their artifacts and some of their important cultural attributes. Then we'll close this video by discussing the Bronze Age collapse and how it affected these civilizations, specifically the Mycenaean civilization. We'll discuss what cultures emerged from the Bronze Age collapse during the so-called Greek Dark Age, and how the events of this period lead to the development of archaic Greece, which is a topic that we'll discuss in a future video. By the way, the image of this slide is a fresco from Crete depicting the Lily Prince, a member of the elite class in the society of ancient Crete. Before we begin the archaeological and historical discussion of the founding of the Greek people, I want to briefly address the mythological beginning of the Greek people. The Greeks were said to be descended from a man named Hellen, father of the Greek people. This is, in the English alphabet, Hellen with two L's, not one. Not to be confused with Helen, one L, of Sparta or of Troy. Hellen was said to be the son of Deucalion and Pyrrha, although some legends say that he was the son of Zeus and Pyrrha, suggesting that the Greeks have divine ancestry. Of course, in actuality, the Greek people were a mix of Indo-European and indigenous Mediterranean, European, and Anatolian cultures that lived in Greece and in the Aegean and surrounding regions. The first Indo-European arrival in Greece is probably about the year 2500 BCE, although scholars will debate these years somewhat. Either way, they usually come out to a date in usually about the mid-2000s BCE. Scholars also have hypothesized that the Dorian invasion of Greece that occurs about the year 1000 BCE was actually a second migration of Indo-European peoples, but we'll talk more about the Indo-Europeans and their migrations to Greece and their impact on the development of Greek culture in a few minutes. With this discussion of the mythological founding of the Greek people in mind, we'll now move on to the archaeological evidence we have for the first Greeks. And the evidence we have for the first Greeks is primarily archaeological because we don't have writing in this part of the world yet. Writing develops down in Mesopotamia about 3500 or so BCE. So in the beginning, the Greeks were the first Europeans to adopt agriculture during the Neolithic period, or the New Stone Age. This is about the 4000s BCE. And the Greeks were some of the first people to adopt agriculture because they were closest or much closer to Anatolia and Mesopotamia, where agriculture was older. Basically, a lot of ideas were spreading from Anatolia and from Mesopotamia, including agriculture. And people will move from Anatolia into Greece. By about the 3200s BCE, the Greeks have adopted the use of bronze working. They're making bronze. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, and it's a lot stronger and more reliable than copper and tin are by themselves. After 3200 BCE, on the Greek mainland, you'll see the development of what are called Eutrasis, Koraku, and Tiern's cultures. And they last from about 3200 BCE to about 2000 or so BCE. This is also known as the early Helladic 1, 2, and 3 period. And this Helladic periodization, it only applies to the Greek mainland. It's not used for the islands or for Crete. It's used for the Greek mainland. Some of the later cultural groups that are going to develop are the Cycladic culture, which is centered on the Greek islands in the Aegean. Then there's the Minoan culture, which is centered on the much larger island of Crete to the south of the Aegean. And then the Mycenaean civilization, as it's often called, which is centered on the mainland of Greece. A couple of quick facts about the Helladic cultures. The Eutrasis are known for advancements in pottery and ceramics and the adoption of bronze. The use of metals, whether it's bronze or much later iron, is an important part of Greek culture, as are ceramics. Other cultures use ceramics as well, but ceramics are an important part of Greek culture, as you'll see during this course. The Koraku are known for building the first semi-monumental architecture. Basically, these sort of long houses. The best example is the House of Tiles. We'll talk about the House of Tiles a little bit later in this video. The Tiern's culture will also make some improvements in pottery and in architecture. And about the early to mid 2000s BCE, a new group of people arrives in Greece, and that is the Indo-European people, or people from what is commonly called the Indo-European culture. The Indo-European people come from the Pontic steppes, a region north of the Black Sea, and now what is basically parts of Ukraine and Russia. They migrate across the world, which we'll talk about in a moment, but one of the places that some of these Indo-European migrants go is Greece. And they're going to mix with the local Helladic peoples, and they're going to create the Mycenaean civilization. We generally don't think that the Indo-European peoples had much of an impact on the Cycladic and the Minoan civilizations, but they definitely had an impact on the Mycenaean civilization, which is evident in their material culture and evident in their language as well. But we'll talk about that a bit more later in the video. Now that I've introduced the Helladic cultures of mainland Greece, I want to talk about the Indo-European people in a little bit more detail. And this map shows that the Indo-European people, as they're often called, they were from the Pontic steppes, basically a region north of the Black Sea. As mentioned before, it's basically what is now parts of Russia and the Ukraine. We don't exactly know why these Indo-European migrations took place. There's a whole host of reasons why they may have taken place, perhaps warfare, perhaps changes to the climate, but these people were semi-nomadic. They were an equestrian culture. They appear to have had their own versions of wagons and chariots. Either they copied chariots from Mesopotamia, or they independently developed their own wheeled vehicles, but that makes them a lot more mobile, and they're going to migrate out of this steppe region, and they will migrate, we think, initially to places like Anatolia. That seems to be one of the first places they migrated, but they also migrated to Western Europe, being the ancestors of several Western European cultures, Celtic cultures, Germanic cultures. The Romans also appear to have some Indo-European ancestry. Slavic people of Central and Eastern Europe also have Indo-European ancestry, and Indo-European people also migrated as far to the east as what is now Iran, The Persian culture has Indo-European elements, and down into what is now India as well, helping to create what is often called the Vedic culture. We'll talk a bit more about some of these migrations in a moment. But Indo-European people also migrated into what is now Greece, and there's good linguistic evidence of this. There's some archaeological evidence of it, and there is some genetic evidence as well that there were Indo-European people that made it down into Greece. We think that these Indo-European migrants, they mixed with the Helladic people that were already in Greece to create the Mycenaean civilization. And the linguistic evidence we have is that the Mycenaean language is an early form of Greek. And they've done extensive linguistic studies on languages like Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Persian, Western European languages, the Celtic languages, the Germanic languages, the Slavic languages. And they think they come from, linguists think they come from a language called Proto-Indo-European. So language is evidence that people are moving out of the steppes. You can see how Proto-Indo-European could have evolved or would have evolved into languages as diverse as Greek, Latin, Celtic languages, Germanic languages, Slavic languages, Persian languages, and Sanskrit. Hittite is also an Indo-European language. It's believed to be one of the oldest of these languages to come from Indo-European. And we use linguistic knowledge to chart the Indo-European migrations. There's also genetic evidence that's been done in recent years, in the past decade or so, that confirms how far these Indo-European invaders or migrants traveled. Some cultures have a lot of steppe Indo-European DNA in the remains of their ancestors. Other cultures have less so. The Greek people of the Mycenaean period, some of them had Indo-European ancestry, highlighting that Indo-European people had made it down into Greece. So Greek culture is a combination of elements from Anatolia in the Middle East, but it's also a combination of elements from the Indo-European people and the Pontic steppes of northeastern Europe. This is another map that has some other interesting details that were not on the previous one. It shows the Indo-European migrations to Greece. This map suggests that the Indo-European migrations took place in two phases. Basically, an early migration, in like perhaps the 2000s BCE. That migration would have helped to create the Mycenaean civilization, and then a later migration, perhaps around 1000 BCE, and that is likely the Dorian migration. The Dorian migration brings an end to the Mycenaean civilization and begins what is often called the Iron Age or the Dark Age in Greek history. We'll talk about the Dorian invasion and the Dark Age of Greece later in this video. But this map also shows a group of people known as the Luvians or the Luwians. More commonly, I've seen it with a W instead of a B. But the Luwian people, we think, may have been or may have played a role in the creation of the city of Troy, suggesting that the Mycenaeans, who had some Indo-European ancestry, were fighting the Trojans, who, via the Luwians, also would have had some Indo-European ancestry, which actually gives some credence to the Homeric myths about the Trojan War, in which the Greeks and the Trojans fight each other, and this conflict is portrayed as a very fratricidal, kind of brother against brother struggle between the Trojans and the Greeks. Even though the Trojans live in Anatolia and the Greeks are living in Greece, they're fighting each other, and it's very much cast as a brother fighting brother type of struggle. And that could be because of a shared Indo-European ancestry, at least in part. How aware Homer was of the Indo-Europeans and their migrations is unclear, but Mythological stories often reveal lost historical information. At the same time, mythology is mythology, and you don't want to rely too heavily on mythological sources. You want to use variety, a variety of sources, archaeological sources, material sources, different types of documentary sources, which could include works of mythology, but also you would use histories and inscriptions, epigraphic evidence. The more evidence you have is better, and there's not really anything, there's not really any bad evidence. It's just how do you use the evidence you have. There are a couple of things about this map that some might take issue with. For example, this map shows the Assyrians as being a Indo-European people, and this, based on my research, is not the academic consensus. Certainly, it seems very likely that the Assyrians were interacting with Indo-Europeans, but the Assyrian language is not an Indo-European language, based on my research. Also, they list the Hittites as being a non-Indo-European people, which seems incorrect because the Hittite language, scholars generally believe it is the oldest of the languages to develop from Proto-Indo-European. So this does not reflect the academic consensus either. I still think it's a useful map, though. The last thing that some people might take issue with this map is the reference to the Aryans or the Indo-Aryans. And the term Aryan comes from the Sanskrit word for Arya, meaning noble ones. And it probably comes from the even older Proto-Indo-European word Aryas, which means to move or to wander or to plow, which makes sense. The Indo-European peoples were migrating. And the Indo-Aryan migration was much later than other Indo-European migrations. It's 1500s BCE or so, and the Indo-Aryans will go on to create the Vedic culture. But the term Aryan can be complicated for some people. It can be a sort of a loaded term. I'm using it in the academic sense, in the original sense, referring to one branch of Indo-European migrants. In this case, the ones that went to India. I'm not using it in the 20th century German sense. And here is a map, a linguistic map of Indo-European languages. As I mentioned on a previous slide, Greek is an Indo-European language along with the Slavic languages, the Germanic languages, and the Celtic languages. English, being that it comes from the Germanic languages, is an Indo-European language technically. Other Indo-European languages include Latin or Italic, or the language that becomes Latin. Usually linguists group Italic and Celtic together as coming from the Proto-Indo-European language and kind of breaking off about the same time. Greek, of course, develops a little bit earlier. Also, keep in mind other languages that are of Indo-European origin are the Persian languages. Persian is Indo-European language, as is Sanskrit, a language that was spoken in India. This small orange dot here, I believe, is meant to represent the Hittite language. Now we should talk about who these Indo-European migrants and invaders were. We generally think that the people who left the Indo-European core in what is now Russia/Ukraine were probably young men, young warriors from Indo-European society. They would have traveled in groups called Koryos. Koryos were basically squadrons of young warriors who left Indo-European society in order to gather fame and fortune for themselves and to conquer and create their own chiefdoms for themselves. And they would have done this in a variety of ways, usually through warfare, but also perhaps through more peaceful migrations as well. It appears that these Indo-European migrations were more peaceful in some areas and more warlike in others, based on archaeological evidence and comparative ethnography, studying different later cultures that were impacted by the Indo-European migrations. It can be difficult to study the Indo-European migrations early on because the Indo-European people did not have a written language. Instead, their descendants developed multiple different written languages in the places that they settled. The Indo-Europeans, of course, went to Greece and transformed Greek culture, and then the Greek language was developed, and the Greek alphabet was developed based on the Phoenician alphabet. The Persians, who had Indo-European people in their past, the Persians adopted cuneiform as their written language. So a lot of the sources we have are written much, much later, so we have to study archaeology and study the various cultures that were impacted by the Indo-Europeans. Now we'll discuss Indo-European weapons. The Indo-Europeans used bronze weapons, swords, daggers, spears, axes. They also used chariots as well for their highly mobile, curious raiding war parties. They often buried their dead with weapons, suggesting they believed that you could take your weapons to the afterlife. It was believed for many years that the Indo-Europeans were the ones who introduced bronze working or technology to the Greeks. Now we believe that the people living in Greece already had bronze making technology, bronze working technology, before the Indo-Europeans even arrived. This is a modern artist's recreation of what a Indo-European chariot would have looked like. This chariot is being used by presumably Koryos warriors. Scholars believe that cultures that have rites of passage for young male warriors probably got this tradition from the Indo-Europeans. For example, the Spartans had the Crypteia, which they believe was a rite of passage, trial by fire for young male Spartan warriors. It was sort of the final stage of their military training, and that this Crypteia may have evolved from earlier Indo-European Koryos parties. We'll talk more about the Crypteia later in this course. Here are some possible archaeological portrayals of the Koryos. This first on the left is from the Yamnaya people. The Yamnaya people were Indo-European people that lived in what is now Russia, so a very early Indo-European culture. And then on the center and the right is a possible Greek portrayal of the Koryos, or of a young warrior entering a rite of passage. This, of course, is from Greece in the center. And then on the right, it's believed to be a statue of a young warrior from the Celtic tradition. Remember, the Greeks and the Celtic peoples had Indo-Europeans in their ancestry. I want to make one final point about the Indo-European migrations, the Indo-European peoples, and the Indo-European influence on ancient Greek culture and religion, and that's regarding the Greek and Indo-European sky gods or sky fathers. The Greeks' sky father and sky god, their king of the gods, is Zeus, and Zeus bears many similarities with other Indo-European sky gods, like Germanic gods such as Odin or Wotan. Also some similarities with Thor, the god of thunder, and also some similarities with Tyr, god of war. And I would argue that Zeus has more in common with these Indo-European derived sky gods. These Germanic deities come from the older Proto-Indo-European tradition, because the Germanic people are of Indo-European ancestry, and Indo-European people made it down into Greece as well. And Zeus seems to be much more Indo-European than he is like the Mesopotamian or Egyptian gods. He seems to behave a lot more like Odin, Thor, or Tyr than he does like the Mesopotamian god Anu or the Egyptian god Amun. The Egyptian and Mesopotamian sky gods are very unchanging. They're in the sky and they have authority, but they're not like Zeus, and they're not like Wotan or Thor, who are going out amongst humans and mixing up with humans and things like that. These Indo-European derived sky gods, of which I argue Zeus is one example, they're much more mercurial, they're much more mobile, they're doing a lot more things, especially things with humans. There's also some linguistic evidence to link Zeus to the Indo-European culture. The Proto-Indo-European word deus seems to have evolved into the later Greek word Zeus via the Mycenaean Greek word diwe or diwo. And Mycenaean Greek, as presented by Linear B, is an early version of Greek. That was confirmed when the language was translated back in the 1950s. But now we'll return to our discussion of pre-Indo-European Greece and the early Helladic cultures, as they're called. Here's an illustration of the stratigraphy of Greece during the Helladic periods. You have Helladic 1, which is lower than Helladic 2. An important trend across Greek history and an important part of Greek culture is seafaring. The Greek peninsula is very rugged, dominated by mountains, like Mount Olympus, seen here. Mount Olympus was traditionally the home of the Greek pantheon. These mountains made agriculture difficult for the ancient Greeks. The mountains also made traversing Greece in the nearby regions by land very difficult. As such, for the ancient Greeks, it was much easier to travel long distances by sea, leading the Greeks, especially the Minoans, to become a seafaring civilization. We'll talk more about Greek seafaring in later videos. Here are some examples of early Helladic pottery coming from primarily the Eutrasis and Koraku cultures. During this period, the Greeks are experimenting with pottery. Ceramics are used for a variety of things in ancient civilizations, including the ancient Greek civilization. Pottery is used as a storage vessel to hold liquids or even to hold solids. It's sort of like ancient Tupperware. And they're not purely functional. They're often decorated as well. This decoration could be art for art's sake, but also some of these decorations could have symbolic or ritual significance. They could be dedicating these pottery vessels to various gods or deities. You can also see that these Helladic potters are experimenting with not only decoration, but with different shapes of pottery. Different shapes of pottery would have different uses. Jars, for example, versus bowls. And so you can see there's quite a bit of adaptation, even in very early examples of Greek pottery. And Greek pottery is going to become even more sophisticated with time. Skill with ceramics will also allow the Greeks to make tiles, which can be used as a building material, like the House of Tiles, which the rooftops of the House of Tiles, of course, were made of tiles. So skill with ceramics is an important part of Greek culture, really from the beginning. Here's an image of the foundation of the House of Tiles, built by the Karakou people. It was built in the Peloponnesian region, which is the southern peninsula of Greece. Here you can see that it's a combination of materials, including bricks and stone. Unlike the ancient Near Eastern civilizations, which built much of their architecture out of mud bricks, the Greeks had access to a variety of materials, including bricks, but also wood and stone, allowing their architecture to be more diverse in terms of materials. Stone also preserves much better and leaves behind more evidence for archaeologists to investigate. Here's a partial reconstruction of the House of Tiles. It has its name because of its tile roof, showing that the Greeks were experimenting with ceramics, making not only pottery, but building materials as well. Tiles like these will be used in later periods as well. Here's an archaeological plan of the House of Tiles site. As you can see, the site was inhabited through many different periods, including the Neolithic and then the Hellenic periods. The site also contains graves as well, shown here. We'll talk more about burial rituals amongst the Bronze Age Greeks later on in this video. Now we'll discuss the Cycladic civilization. Cycladic civilization was a seafaring civilization that inhabited the islands of the Aegean Sea from about 3200 to 2000 BCE, although some archaeologists think they may have inhabited these islands as late as 1000 BCE. The Cycladic civilization also had a presence on the Greek mainland as well. Archaeologists and scholars think the Cycladic civilization focused on seafaring, fishing, and trading. Perhaps their greatest cultural accomplishment are their figurines, seen here. Here are the Cycladic Islands, right in the middle of the Aegean Sea. In archaeology, just like real estate, we believe in the rule of location. Location, location, location. The Cycladic Islands, centered right in the middle of the Aegean Sea, would have given the people of the Cycladic civilization easy access to the Greek mainland, to Crete, and also to Asia Minor, facilitating their trade expeditions. Here are some examples of Cycladic figurines. Most of their figurines are fairly small, no more than a few feet high. Initial sculptures are very geometric, but they become rounder with time as the sculptor's techniques improved. Over time, anatomical features in clothing would become clearer. So seriation, as a form of relative dating, works well with the Cycladic figurines. Over time, the Cycladic sculptures made their images more anatomically correct. They also added clothing. We think these triangles represent loincloths, and we think this pattern here represents some kind of bandolier. The Cycladic civilization also made pottery. We call these examples of Cycladic pottery frying pans. You can see there's quite a bit of sophistication even from this early Greek civilization. These carvings are very intricate, and scholars think they may have some kind of symbolic meaning. Perhaps they represent the sun or waves of the sea, things that would have been very important to the Cycladic people. The decorations are very ornate. These vessels don't show any sign of being used for cooking. There's no signs of burning or carbon. We think they may have been ritual objects. Perhaps they held mirrors at some point. Here is an artistic recreation of what Cycladic people would have looked like. As you can see, they're using primitive bronze weapons. They've also decorated themselves with paint, drawing designs that are very similar to those found on the fry pans. We can also see some of their figurines here in the background. The artist who drew this image probably drew from images of the later Minoan civilization in order to create these people. Here are some views of Cycladic settlements in the Aegean Islands. As you can see, they're building out of stone, and they're building separate buildings within their complexes, suggesting different spaces for work, sleep, leisure, and storage, or for separation of family units. We also see that their settlements have walls, implying they were possibly trying to keep foreign invaders, perhaps the Minoans, out. They may also have been trying to guard treasures they had gained during their trading expeditions, perhaps from pirates. Now we'll discuss the end of the Cycladic civilization. The Cycladic civilization seems to have begun to dissolve around 2000 BCE, losing much of its cultural influence. The Cycladic civilization was probably absorbed into the larger and more powerful Minoan culture. Some archaeologists think that a natural disaster, like a volcano, might have hastened the Cycladic decline, as seen with many other ancient civilizations. Some archaeologists think that pockets of Cycladic culture may have existed as late as 1000 BCE. Now that we've discussed the Cycladic civilization, I want to move on to talking about the Minoan culture, a fascinating civilization that was centered on the island of Crete. And when we're talking about the Minoan culture, we're generally referring to what is often called the palatial period or the palace period of Minoan culture. And this is from about the 2000s to about 1450 or so BCE. And we don't know what the Minoans called themselves. We call them Minoans, naming them after the legendary King Minos, a legendary king from Crete. And we don't know what the Minoans called themselves because we have not deciphered their language, Linear A. A very important archaeologist who did a lot of work on the Minoan civilization was Sir Arthur Evans, who investigated and excavated Minoan sites from about 1900 to 1905. And in his initial studies on the Minoans, Evans concluded that the Minoans were Egyptians, or that they were Egyptians who colonized Crete. More recent genetic tests done on human remains amongst the Minoan culture, or human remains of Minoans, have shown that the Minoans were most closely genetically related to people in the Aegean region and in Anatolia. They're much more closely related to the people of mainland Greece than they are to the Egyptians or to other groups of people. That genetic test that was done in 2017, did not find any Indo-European or steppe DNA amongst the remains they studied, but they studied a very small sample size of human remains. Arthur Evans, of course, would not have had access to genetic testing in the early 20th century. And his conclusion that the Minoans were related to the Egyptians, we would say it has some issues as well, just because in archaeology, it is said that pots aren't people, meaning that material culture doesn't necessarily indicate that a certain civilization was in a certain place at a certain time. You might find one civilization's material culture in another place, but it could be because of trade networks, or it could be because civilizations learned from each other. So the Minoans were not Egyptian, but they were certainly learning from the civilizations around them, including the Egyptians. There's some similarities between Egyptian wall paintings and Minoan frescoes that you'll see later in this video. And the Minoans would have had an opportunity to learn from other civilizations because they had very extensive trade networks in the Mediterranean. They were trading with Egypt and with the Middle East and with Anatolia and with mainland Greece. And these trade networks allowed the Minoans to become very, very wealthy. They were buying and selling goods, and then they were building palaces. We'll talk about how the Minoan economy functioned a little bit later in this video. And although we haven't deciphered Linear A, it seems very likely that the Minoans used Linear A to record their business transactions. And the Minoan civilization was focused on trade. It was focused on building large palaces. They would have had some armed forces. They would have had some like naval vessels to protect their shipping. And we found weapons at their sites, but they're a lot less militaristic than the Mycenaean Greeks of the Greek mainland. The Mycenaean Greek culture was significantly impacted by the very militaristic Indo-European migrations, but those migrations don't seem to have had an effect on the Minoan culture, and the Minoan culture remains a lot less militaristic. And the Minoan civilization will begin to collapse, and there are several factors. We think that there may have been some natural disasters that caused their trade networks to be damaged, that caused their economy to suffer, but they also appear to have been dealing with foreign invasions, primarily from the Mycenaean or mainland Greeks. So this is a general summary of the Minoan culture, and we'll dig more into their culture, their economy, and their artifacts in the coming slides. Here is a map of the Minoan trade networks, showing what products they bought and sold and where. As you can see, the Minoans may have traded with places as far-flung as Spain on the far western coast of the Mediterranean. They're also trading heavily with Egypt and with the ancient Near East, and of course with the Greek mainland. They may have even traded with the Italian peninsula as well. Here's a fresco showing Minoan seafaring. The fresco features a sailing vessel in the foreground and a harbor in the background, highlighting the importance of seafaring trade to the Minoans. Here are some images of Linear A. Archaeologists and philologists, people who study languages, are not sure if Linear A is an alphabet or if it's a writing system that combines pictograms with symbols that represent syllables. As of now, Linear A remains undeciphered, but it does bear some similarities with Linear B, the script used by the Mycenaeans. Linear B, by the way, has been translated. The Minoan civilization is known for its art, especially frescoes. Minoan two-dimensional art was dominated by frescoes. Frescoes are a type of painting that involves the decoration of wet plaster. They take their name from the Italian word fresco for fresh. Artists would paint their figures into the wet plaster. These pigments would dry with the plaster over time, and although some restoration has had to be done on the Minoan frescoes, they're remarkably well preserved because of this painting method. We can see that in the frescoes, the Minoan artists preferred to display their subjects from the profile perspective, much like the Egyptians, suggesting a possible Egyptian influence. The human figures are stylized and triangular, like the Egyptians, although it's my personal opinion that the Minoans depicted their human subjects in a manner that's a little bit more anatomically correct. But what you see is the Minoans depicted their subjects, their human subjects, with very narrow waists, like the Egyptian art. So there's a cross-pollination of artistic traditions. Male subjects, men, are usually portrayed with darker skin than women. Men are portrayed here on the left. These two images are of frescoes of women on the right. The frescoes usually do not include inscriptions or captions. Even if they did, we probably wouldn't be able to read them because they'd be written in Linear A. These frescoes give archaeologists important glimpses into everyday Minoan life, including their class and gender norms. As you can see, men are portrayed with darker skin, women are portrayed with lighter skin. This may show the Minoan civilization's preference for men working outdoors, developing tanner skin, while women work indoors with the family, showing that the Minoan civilization was more patriarchal than matriarchal. We also see class differences as well, particularly in how working class and upper class Minoans are attired, what kind of clothing they wear. We'll discuss that on another slide. For perspective, here are some shots of 2D Egyptian visual art. You can see the similarities between Minoan and Egyptian visual art. The image on the painting on the right-hand side of the slide actually is of Minoan people visiting Egypt. You'll remember that non-Egyptian people in Egyptian art are often portrayed wearing very colorful clothing. And the clothing that these workers are shown wearing is very similar to the loincloths that Minoan artists often portrayed their men wearing. By the way, the Egyptians probably called the Minoans the Keftiu, meaning the people of the islands in the middle of the sea, a reference to Crete and surrounding islands. Remember, the Minoans probably did not actually call themselves Minoans. That was a term used by later archaeologists and scholars like Sir Arthur Evans. The Minoans may have referred to themselves as the nail that holds everything together, a reference to Crete's sort of central location between Greece, Anatolia, and Egypt and North Africa, and the fact that the Minoans were traders, and that they engaged in manufacturing, and that they kind of did a little bit of everything in their culture. That is, trade, manufacturing, and agriculture. Here are some images of poorer, everyday Minoans portrayed in fresco, and it's very interesting to see the Minoan culture not just portraying elite people, their kings, their priestesses, their military leaders, they're portraying everyday people as well. And we can make some observations about clothing and about gender norms and gender rules in Minoan society. We can also make some inferences about class in Minoan society as well. The clothing of everyday working Minoans seems to be simpler than that of elite Minoans, but there are some continuities, particularly in the revealing nature of Minoan women's clothing. And you can see the kind of clothing or lack thereof that working people in the Minoan society are going to be using. You can see these working Minoans doing things like fishing or gathering crops like saffron. Saffron was a very lucrative crop, a spice. Saffron is still, of course, very expensive today. And working class Minoans, whether they were free people or slaves, would have done the bulk of the labor in Minoan society, providing for the elite. On their heads, working class or peasant or enslaved Minoans seem to be wearing perhaps a type of woven cap. Perhaps it's something like a modern day beanie. We don't really know for sure because we haven't deciphered linear A. Another explanation, and one that I think is actually a bit more plausible, is that this is some kind of haircut that's reserved for poor Minoans, peasant Minoans, or for slaves even. It could be that this blue is actually very, very short, sort of stubble-like hair with longer hair that's worn in braids. And it seems that this style may have been used by both men and women, which is very interesting. But we just don't know for sure because we don't have a deciphered Minoan language. We're still working on trying to decipher linear A. So we have to basically study these frescoes very carefully, compare them to the visual art of other cultures. Other cultures actually mention having special hairstyles that are reserved for slaves. So that's why we think that this maybe is a hairstyle for slaves based on what we're seeing in these frescoes. We also see amongst poor Minoans that men are portrayed with darker, redder skin, and women are portrayed with lighter, whiter skin. This might be to highlight the patriarchal nature of Minoan society. that men are supposed to be outside working, fishing, working in the outdoor setting, whereas women are supposed to keep their skin lighter. Um, it's hard to say for sure. It appears that the Minoan society is less patriarchal and more matriarchal, that women have more power and authority in the Minoan society. But once again, this is something that we'll know better once we've deciphered the Minoan Linear A language. And there's also evidence that Minoan women of all classes, they wore jewelry, like earrings, for example. Minoan women of all classes may have worn cosmetics as well. There's good sort of visual fresco evidence of this. So even though there are some differences in how working class and poor and enslaved Minoans are portrayed, less expensive clothing, this strange headwear or strange hairstyle, there are some continuities as well in how men have darker skin, women have lighter skin, and women's clothing is very sexualized and revealing, and women are also using things like jewelry and cosmetics. And these images, they come from not Crete itself, but from the island of Santorini, where it's pretty clear there was a Minoan presence. Minoans would have been trading throughout the region, and it seems that Minoans also would have settled on these other islands to facilitate their trade. Basically, a form of colonization. Here is an image of an upper-class Minoan woman being attended by men of the working class. As you can see, her dress is very revealing, and all the subjects are portrayed with very small waists. Here is a fresco of a working-class Minoan harvesting saffron flowers, while an upper-class woman looks on. Here are some modern recreations of Minoan clothing. As you can see, they are very revealing. Minoan women's dresses, the neckline is very low, and they seem to have some type of built-in corset here to make the waist look smaller. And of course, men's clothing is quite revealing as well with these loincloths. Here are some modern reenactors portraying Minoan women in their traditional garb, performing some kind of either ball dance or ball sport that is portrayed in Minoan frescoes and visual art. Here are some figurines of Minoan women, which also can be used in addition to visual 2D art to recreate how women may have dressed in this society. Women are depicted prominently throughout Minoan art, as you've seen so far in this video. We believe this is because Minoan society was a lot less patriarchal and probably somewhat more matriarchal than mainland Greek society or Mycenaean society that's around at about the same time as the Minoans. Of course, a patriarchal society is a society in which men are in control, and a matriarchal society is a society in which women are in control. We think that, relatively speaking, Minoan society allowed women to have a lot more control and power over things, particularly when it came to religion and spirituality, we think. On the right-hand side of the slide is a figurine of, we believe it's a Minoan snake goddess, a very important deity in their religious beliefs and their spirituality. This Minoan snake goddess may have inspired the later Greek mythical figure of Medusa. Because of their significant wealth, the Minoans had increased resource surpluses and thus increased divisions of labor. These surpluses and divisions would have allowed more time for leisure, entertainment, and sports. One activity depicted in the frescoes was bull leaping, seen here. Bull leaping may have been a sport, but it may have also had spiritual and religious connotations, which we'll discuss later. What's interesting is this fresco shows both women and men participating in bull leaping. The male figure, portrayed in red, leaps over the bull and is flanked by two women. Perhaps they're distracting the bull while the man leaps over, or perhaps they're getting ready to leap over the bull themselves. We don't exactly know what the original artists intended with this fresco. Perhaps this is meant to be an action shot of some kind, or perhaps it's meant to be a progression, with one woman having leaped first, followed by the man as another woman gets ready to leap. In a way, perhaps it's an ancient comic strip. Here is a restoration, an enhancement of the bull leaping fresco. You can see that the male has the beginnings of a slight beard, which is somewhat unusual because Minoan males are usually portrayed clean-shaven. The women wear similar garb to the male bull leaper, which once again suggests that they're not just in this image for show, they're here because women participated in bull leaping as well. The Minoans also enjoyed boxing. Boxing was a blood sport that could be bet on. Images of Minoan boxing often depict young boys fighting. It's possible that boxing may have been a form of military training as well for the Minoans. In addition to portraying people and activities, the Minoans also portrayed animals in their frescoes. This fresco shows dolphins and a variety of species of fish. And this piece of a fresco here shows pheasants, which would have been an important food source for the Minoans. Here's a partial reconstruction of the Palace of Knossos with a fresco and colored columns. These are a series of aqueducts that would have pumped fresh water into the Palace of Knossos, giving the palace's residents access to clean water which they could use to drink, to prepare food, and of course to do things like bathing and for washing away waste as well. This is a decorated Minoan bathtub. We believe that the Minoans put a lot of emphasis on cleanliness, building water pipes and aqueducts for their palaces, keeping bathtubs that could be used for cleanliness and for cleaning. There's a lot of material evidence for the Minoans' emphasis on hygiene. This is a toilet at the Palace of Knossos. Once again, fresh water being brought in by pipes would be used to basically flush these toilets. Here is a model of a Minoan floor heating system. It's very similar to the later Roman hypocaust. Basically, fires, wood burning in the basement areas would heat the floors and then heat the entire palace. So the Minoans were developing very sophisticated plumbing technology, but also heating systems for their palaces as well. And here is an example of what this heating system might have looked like at Knossos. In this area, there would be fires, and then the fires would project heat upward, heating the entire palace. The Palace of Knossos, based on archaeological research, was a very large, impressive complex that was ornately decorated with frescoes and colored columns. As you can see, it has a variety of chambers for different types of use. It features courts, halls, areas for performances, places where arms are stored, storage areas, and even places of burial. Visitors to the Palace of Knossos would have been impressed with its size. They may have even been intimidated by its large collection of labyrinth-like rooms. But we'll discuss labyrinths more in a moment. Here are some artists' recreations of life at the Palace of Knossos. Here's a representation of the Lily Prince seen at the beginning of this video. As you can see, life for the elite of the Minoan civilization was probably pretty good, but it was dependent upon the labor of the working and lower classes, and probably on slaves as well, seen here and here. Their labor would have kept the upper classes fed, allowing them to pursue things like entertainment. Now I want to talk a little bit more about the Minoan economy. As mentioned previously, the Minoan economy, at least the domestic Minoan economy, that is, the economy centered on the island of Crete, was a redistributive economy. It was not a market economy where people bought and sold freely. Rather, people would bring goods to the palace, and then they would have those goods redistributed. Olive oil and wine and wheat, saffron, metal goods even would be distributed to the people, and then the palace, the king and his administrators would keep a large portion for themselves to fund the opulent, even hedonistic lifestyle of the palaces. Outside of the island of Crete, though, the Minoans had very extensive trade networks and a maritime trade-based economy. They would buy and sell goods from across the Mediterranean basin, and the buying and selling of these goods made the Minoans very, very wealthy because they kept these profits for themselves, of course. The Minoans, they exported a lot of goods, pottery, metal goods, agricultural products like saffron, which is a very expensive spice, and the export of these goods also would have made them wealthy, would have allowed them to have very good trade surpluses. They also imported goods from other parts of the Mediterranean world, from Egypt, from the Levantine coast, from Anatolia, and from mainland Greece. So in addition to their redistributive economy on the island of Crete, the Minoans also had a very large foreign trade-based economy as well that included both imports and exports. And these economic systems were greatly facilitated by the use of writing, specifically the Minoans' Linear A script, which has not been deciphered, but we believe would have been used for trade purposes, since writing systems have been used for trade since the development of the first scripts. Now we'll briefly discuss the legend of Theseus and the Minotaur, because I think it reveals how contemporary civilizations might have viewed the Minoans. Keep in mind, though, that the legend of Theseus and the Minotaur was recorded centuries after the Minoan civilization came to an end. For those of you that are not aware of the story, Theseus, Prince of Athens, kills the Minotaur, a bull man monster belonging to King Minos of Crete. Theseus accomplishes this with the help of Minos' daughter Ariadne, shown here. The Minotaur lived in a labyrinth and consumed human prisoners. The large size of the Palace of Knossos and bull leaping and the stratified nature of Minoan society, with the elite being dependent on the labor of the working class, may have also inspired this myth. The Minoan religion, which included elements of human sacrifice and worship of animal deities, may have also played into this story as well. Perhaps the Minotaur was not a monster, but a priest wearing a bull mask of some kind. This myth also reveals the tension between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans of the Greek mainland. Theseus was from Athens, on the Greek mainland. Most of the images we have of Theseus and Ariadne are from centuries later. Here you can see a Greek image from centuries after the Minoans, and you can see later medieval and Renaissance era depictions of the myth. Considering the large maze-like floor plan of the Palace of Knossos, it's easy to see how the story of Theseus and the labyrinth may have evolved. This legend may have been based on mainland Greeks' visits to the Palace of Knossos and seeing how large and maze-like and easy to get lost in the palace it was. Here are some artifacts to illustrate Minoan religion and spirituality. Based on the artifacts we have, archaeologists think that the Minoan religion was more pantheistic than the religion of the Greeks in later periods. There's a possible Egyptian and Mesopotamian influence in the Minoan religion as a result of the trade relations between the Minoans, the Egyptians, and the people of the ancient Near East. Bulls seem to be sacred to the Minoans based on their depiction of bulls in their carvings, seen at right. Archaeologists also think that the Minoans may have worshipped a mother goddess with snakes, seen here at left. Interestingly, the Minoans also allowed women to serve as priestesses, something that not all ancient civilizations permitted. This is a figurine believed to be of a Minoan goddess, possibly a sky goddess. It's a little bit different than the snake goddess figurine we looked at on the previous slide. This figure is not holding the snakes in her hands, rather the snakes are wrapped around her arms. It's possible that it may just be a variation of the holding snakes goddess, or it could be a variation or inspired by non-Minoan deities, like either the Egyptian/Canaanite goddess Ketesh. Ketesh was a sky goddess. The gods or goddesses of the sky are often very powerful deities. This could be a very powerful goddess in the Minoan pantheon, perhaps even the queen of their gods. And the frequency in which female figures are represented in Minoan religious art, it's evidence that their society was less patriarchal and perhaps more matriarchal than the mainland Greek society was. We also think these headdresses may have been worn by priestesses. So when you see a female Minoan figurine or a Minoan woman with a headdress like this in a fresco, it's possible that she is a priestess as well. This is a Minoan funerary building from about the 1900s BCE. It's at Petras. And above this is a reconstruction of what a Minoan funerary building would have looked like. This is actually a reconstruction from a different site at Gornia, but it gives an idea of what these buildings would have looked like. They're very square, boxy buildings, and they were meant to be basically houses of the dead. Rituals and libations would be consumed to honor the deceased. The Minoans practiced secondary burial, in which they took the bones of the deceased after the flesh had decomposed away, and then they replaced them in smaller vessels, which would allow these tombs to be used for longer periods of time. They could hold more remains. And so they're basically multi-generational family tombs. And the buildings themselves seem to have been inspired by Egyptian traditions from about the same time. The Egyptians also believed in honoring the dead and having food left for the dead and consuming meals in honor of the dead. And what you'll notice is that Minoan burial traditions change over time. You'll see more of a mainland Greek influence. And I also think there is an element of social stratification as well in Minoan tombs and burial traditions. Richer people are going to have nicer tombs built for themselves and their families, and they're going to have nicer vessels for burying and reburying their dead. But we'll look at some examples on the next couple of slides. Here are some more images related to Minoan burial rituals and burial traditions. Over time, the burial buildings on Crete change. You see fewer of the Egyptian-style funerary buildings, and you see more basically smaller versions of the tholos tombs that were built on the mainland of Greece. And this was probably because either Mycenaean mainland Greek people were basically settling in and invading Crete, colonizing Crete. It also could be just because Minoan culture is losing its prominence. What is left of the Minoan civilization as it's coming to an end is copying the Mycenaean civilization. They're building these dome-shaped tombs. In addition to tombs, the Minoans also made ossuaries for secondary burial. Basically, they would take the bones of the dead after the flesh had decomposed, and they would place the bones in these basically in an ossuary, a bone box that's called a larnax. And these the larnax would vary in quality. Some were very intricately decorated, like this one, which is from the 1400s to the 1200s BCE. Others are a lot plainer. So tombs, secondary burial, and the larnax, the bone box, are all very important themes in Minoan burial customs. There's also good evidence of social stratification in Minoan graves and burial traditions. The larnax could vary in quality. The larnax of a wealthy person would be very well decorated. It would be well painted, very intricate. The larnax of a poorer person would be much simpler. Also, wealthier people would have been buried in tombs or in funerary buildings, but the poor might just be buried directly in the ground. And on this slide, you can see a larnax of what we believe was a poorer person. It's not very well decorated. And on this side of the slide, you see graves. These are from a little bit later, from about the 1200s BCE, so they may have been dug by mainland Greek people, Achaean people, as they're often known, who were coming to Greece at that point. Either way, though, you can see that there is social stratification. There's nicer graves that are much more extravagant. There's nicer ways to store the bones of the dead, and then there's much simpler graves. Here are some examples of Minoan larnaces. Larnaces is the plural for larnax, and you can see that the bones of the deceased are placed in as a form of secondary burial. How did the Minoan civilization come to an end? Evidence suggests that the Minoan civilization collapsed as an independent entity between the years 1450 and 1200 BCE. The Santorini volcano, further to the north in the Aegean Islands, erupted around 1600 BCE, and it may have caused flooding and earthquakes as far away as Crete, seen here on the right. Some scholars think that this natural disaster may have inspired the later legend of Atlantis. Volcanic ash from the Santorini volcano may have caused crop failures and famines as well. These cataclysmic events would have made it more difficult to fend off foreign invasions, especially from the Mycenaeans, who would have had a score to settle with the Minoans, as shown by the story of Theseus and the Minotaur. There is evidence of a Mycenaean takeover by the 1200s BCE, in which the palace of Knossos was damaged. Now we'll discuss Mycenaean Greece, a civilization which lasted from about 1750 to 1050 BCE. Like the later Greek city-states, the Mycenaean Greeks were not united into a single empire. Rather, there were spheres of influence within Mycenaean Greece, one surrounding Mycenae, their most important city, but also one around what would become Sparta and what would become Athens. Athens and Sparta were probably small settlements or villages at this point. Mycenae, by far, was their most important city. Here is a view of Mycenae's Lion Gate and the dry stone wall fortifications of this city. To begin, here are some facts about the Mycenaean civilization. They're centered on mainland Greece, unlike the Cycladic and Minoan civilizations, which were based on islands off the coast of Greece. The Mycenaean civilization was divided into a series of small kingdoms that were ruled basically by fortresses called citadels. You can see an example of a citadel here. This citadel at Mycenae is the most powerful, and that's why they're called the Mycenaean civilization. In a lot of ways, these citadels are a little bit like the later Greek city-states in the sense that they are not united together, but they share a similar cause, similar linguistics, similar cultural and religious traditions, but they are only united during certain periods. They'll come together to fight external enemies. We don't exactly know what the Mycenaeans, or the Greeks that we refer to today as the Mycenaeans, were called. They may have called themselves the Achaeans. The term Achaean is used quite a bit in the Homeric epics. Homer did not live during the Mycenaean period. He lived much later, but he was writing about mythical events that would have occurred about the time of the Mycenaean civilization. So they may have called themselves Achaeans to refer to themselves as a whole. And Achaia is a region in the northern Peloponnesian part of Greece. The Peloponnesian Peninsula is the southern peninsula in Greece, and it's basically where Mycenae and where a lot of the most important Mycenaean era citadels are. Also, the Hittites seem to have called the people in this region the Achaea, so that seems to corroborate the idea that the Mycenaeans may have called themselves Achaeans. We'll refer to them as Mycenaeans in this video, just because that's how most people know them. And as I mentioned before, they're known for their citadels. These are walled fortresses that are built on hills. The Mycenaean culture is much more militaristic than the Minoan culture. They need these walled citadels to defend themselves from foreign attacks, but also probably from attacks from other Mycenaean Greek citadels. They also build very spectacular tholos tombs, or dome-shaped tombs. And the tholos tombs on mainland Greece are generally bigger than the tholos tombs in Crete. And the Mycenaeans do have artwork. They do have some frescoes. They do have their famous burial masks that we'll talk about later in this video. But I argue that much of their art is derivative of other civilizations' art, especially the Minoans. They're copying a lot of what other civilizations are doing, especially the Minoan civilization. And they're probably copying art much more than making original stuff, because they're a very militaristic culture, very warlike culture, definitely more militaristic than the Minoans were. And that's actually shown in their art. The frescoes they have feature warfare very prominently, and they portray things a little bit differently than the Minoans do. And they use bronze weapons. This is a Bronze Age civilization, and they will attack rival citadels. And it would seem that they attack the city of Troy, as told by the Homeric epics. And the Mycenaean civilization, it will collapse about the 1000s BCE after an invasion from the Dorian civilization. The Dorian civilization, they were probably a Indo-European people, and they probably had iron weapons, which Iron is a lot stronger than bronze, and it would have allowed the Dorians to have a edge on the Mycenaeans. There also may have been invasions from what people called the Sea Peoples, who would have invaded from the ocean. So the Mycenaean civilization collapses violently about the 1000s. There's probably invasions from the north, from the Dorians, and then there's likely raids from the sea as well, from the Sea People. And a very important archaeologist who studied the Mycenaeans is Heinrich Schliemann. He investigated the civilization in the 1870s. He did excavations at Mycenae, and he did excavations at Troy as well. Before I continue our discussion of the Mycenaean civilization, I want to emphasize the Indo-European invaders' role in the creation of the Mycenaean civilization. The Indo-European people began migrating to or invading mainland Greece in the early 2000s BCE. And as we discussed previously, the Indo-European culture is very militaristic. It's also patriarchal as well. And it seems that it was more patriarchal and more militaristic than the local Helladic societies that were already living there. And the Helladic people that we talked about before, there's quite a bit of movement between the Aegean region and Anatolia. But now they're joined by this people from much further to the north. And we think that the Indo-Europeans introduced new military technologies, better, stronger bronze weapons, chariots, and wagons. As you can see here on this image, you also see the boar tusk helmet. These helmets are made of the teeth from wild boar, and they're you're going to see them quite a bit in Mycenaean visual art. Some people also think that the Mycenaeans may have introduced a type of pottery called minion ware. We don't know for sure. A lot of that depends on when you think the Indo-Europeans arrived in mainland Greece. If you have them arriving earlier, then maybe they did introduce minion ware. But if you have them arriving later, then minion ware would have already been made by the Helladic people that were there before the Indo-Europeans. Genetic tests done on Greeks from the Mycenaean era, the samples, which were very limited, they only did about 4 samples from 4 individuals. It showed 4 to 16% Indo-European steppe DNA. About 2/3 of their genetics were from Aegean Anatolian people. So there definitely were Indo-European people in Greece during the Mycenaean civilization. Arguably, they helped to create the Mycenaean civilization, but there were probably not as many Indo-Europeans compared to Helladic people that were living there. But even if the Indo-Europeans came in very small numbers, it seems that they really had a defining impact on the Helladic cultures and really helped to create the Greek culture of antiquity that we think of. They brought in a language, Linear B as its script. It was deciphered in the 1950s. It is a form of Proto-Greek. They've done enough studies on Linear B and later Greek language to confirm that Linear B, the Mycenaean language, was a form of Greek. And remember, Greek came from Proto-Indo-European. And certainly the Mycenaean culture is very warlike. It's definitely more patriarchal than the Minoan culture. Emphasis on patriarchy, emphasis on militarism, those are Indo-European traditions. And this has led some people to wonder if when the Indo-European invaders, when the Indo-European war parties came in, if they basically just took over, overwhelmed and took over the Helladic cultures and became the new ruling class. They were basically a minority ruling over a Helladic majority that had already been there for a while. And that would have actually some credence, again, if we use later mythological sources like the Iliad and the Odyssey. These Indo-European invaders would have had certainly a lighter complexion, lighter hair than the people that were already living in Greece who were from Anatolia and the Aegean region, whose skin complexion would have been a bit darker, more what we would think of as a Mediterranean skin color, olive skinned, you might say. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey talks about leaders on the Greek side having lighter hair, blonde hair, light red hair. It mentions Achilles having blonde hair. It mentions Menelaus having reddish hair. It mentions Odysseus having blonde hair, but Odysseus is always changing his appearance because Athena is always giving him new disguises. But we'll talk a bit more about ethnicity and race amongst the Greeks in a future video. But we'll turn our discussion back to Linear B and the Mycenaean language. Here is a view of Linear B, the Mycenaean script. Symbolically, it looks a lot like Linear A, but scholars have actually been able to translate Linear B, something they failed to do for Linear A. Here is a view of the Mycenae archaeological site. As you can see, the Mycenaean Greeks used a lot more stone than the civilizations of the ancient Near East. They used a variety of different types of stone masonry as well. They used large stones arranged using dry stone masonry to create their walls, and they used smaller stonework to create interior buildings. Here is a shot of the lion gates of Mycenae, circa 1250 or so BCE. In the ancient world, lions were a symbol of kings and of military prowess. These lions would have been there to impress, but also to intimidate rivals. And you can see the walls are built with this very sophisticated dry stone masonry, very large stones. It's called Cyclopean masonry because later Greeks, looking at the ruins of Mycenae, they concluded that these walls must have been built by Cyclops, one-eyed monsters who were very strong. In actuality, the Mycenaeans built these walls because they needed them to protect their citadels, and it would have taken a lot of division of labor, a lot of resources to build them, so it just shows how important defense was to the Mycenaeans. On the whole, Mycenaean architecture is plainer than that of the Minoan culture, reflecting the more militaristic and war-like nature of the Mycenaean society. They built dry stone walls, they used different types of masonry, but they did make some elaborate gates, like the Lion Gate. Lions represented military strength and royalty in the ancient Mediterranean and ancient Near East. The Mycenaeans made frescoes as well, but they're not of the same quality as those made by the Minoans, as you'll see soon. Here is a modern artist's rendering of what a Mycenaean citadel would have looked like. As you can see, the citadel is surrounded by Cyclopean masonry walls. These are dry stone walls made of very large stones. The Greeks, looking back at Mycenaean ruins centuries later, theorized that these ruins had been built by a species of cyclops, one-eyed monsters that were much stronger than humans. They could move these large stones into place and fit them together without mortar because they are dry stone masonry. As you can see, the citadel is built on a hill to give the residents of the citadel a line of sight and an easier defense. The Mycenaean city-states were much more in danger of being attacked from the land than the Minoan palaces were, so they are much more fortified than the Minoan palaces. Now we'll discuss some of the architectural features of these Mycenaean citadels. The Mycenaeans also had water delivery systems in their citadels. although their systems generally are a lot less architecturally sophisticated than those of the Minoans. They have some pipe and drainage systems, but they don't have these aqueducts that bring fresh water in from elsewhere. Instead, the Mycenaeans relied on a series of cisterns. These cisterns, of course, would have collected water from the rains, and this would have given the Mycenaeans a water supply that they could have drawn from during long sieges. The Minoan style of aqueducts actually are very vulnerable to attacks from enemies. The first thing an enemy would do would be cut off the city they're attacking's water supply. But if the city is relying on cisterns, then they'll be able to survive a siege for a lot longer. So the Mycenaeans' architectural choices reflect their more militaristic society, their society that's focused on warfare and defending their settlements, their citadels. This is the cistern of Mycenae. The water doesn't look very appetizing, but the cistern does its job of providing water during sieges. The Mycenaeans also centered their citadels around the Great Hall or Megaron. The Megaron was a gathering place where elite and working class Mycenaeans would come together to petition their kings and to have goods redistributed. The Mycenaeans, we think, had a redistributive economy, just like the Minoans did. That is, people in the countryside would bring their produce to the citadel, and then the kings and their administrators would divide the goods between the people. And of course, the kings and their administrators would keep a lot of those goods for themselves. The Minoans took those goods and used them to make large palaces and to put on sporting events and things like that. The Mycenaeans, however, took goods and kept them to sustain their militaries. And of course, there's an Indo-European influence in these great halls as well. A lot of Indo-European cultures will have great halls where leaders will gather with their people. And a lot of these great halls will be centered on a hearth of some kind, which provides warmth, but also can be used for cooking as well. And you can see the great hearth of this great hall here. This is the floor plan of a megaron or great hall. There's a series of columns holding up the roof. There's a vestibule where people wait before going into the main part of the great hall. And of course, there is a hearth in the center of the throne room of the megaron. And this is an artist's recreation of what a megaron may have looked like. Notice the columns, notice the hearth. There's also decorations on the columns and throughout the building. The Mycenaeans were generally less interested in visual art than the Minoans were, but they still made visual art just in their own style. It was inspired by the Minoans, but had some key differences as well. Here is a modern reconstruction of a megaron, complete with a throne where the king would sit. This is the excavated foundation of the megaron at Pylos or Pylos. It's believed to be the great hall of the legendary Greek king Nestor, who is mentioned in the Odyssey. Now that we've discussed Mycenaean architecture and the structure of Mycenaean society, we can discuss Mycenaean religion. The Mycenaeans had temples in their citadels, and at their temples they worshipped, we think, early versions of later Greek deities, including Zeus and Hera. Zeus, of course, is the god of thunder and lightning. He's the king of the gods. There's a strong Indo-European influence in the creation of Zeus. We think the Mycenaeans also worshipped Hera, queen of the gods, wife and consort to Zeus. They probably also worshipped a version of Poseidon, the god of the sea. This makes sense because the Greeks are a maritime, seafaring culture. They would want to worship a god of the sea to protect their shipping and to prevent storms and to have favorable winds. They also likely worshipped Artemis, a version of Artemis, goddess of the hunt. Hunting would have been very important in Mycenaean society. It would have been a source of food, but also a sport and form of entertainment, particularly for wealthy people, elite people in Mycenaean society. We also think the Mycenaeans worshipped slash feared human-animal hybrids called daemons. It's possible these daemons would inspire later Greek spiritual figures like Pan, for example, who had the physical features of both a human and a goat. We think the Mycenaeans had priestesses in their religion, but on the whole, their religion appears to be a lot more patriarchal, and it seems to be more Indo-European in its flavor than the religion of the Minoans. The Minoan religion is arguably much more influenced by Egyptian and ancient Near Eastern spirituality. This is a Mycenaean fresco of either a priestess making an offering of grain, or perhaps of the goddess Demeter. Demeter was the Greek goddess of agriculture. Here are some Mycenaean religious artifacts. On the left is a bronze figurine of a male, believed to possibly be Zeus because of the posture of the arm. Perhaps the arm is casting a lightning bolt, throwing a lightning bolt the way Zeus would have done. On the right-hand side is a figurine believed to be of a woman, of a female, either a female goddess or perhaps a priestess. We don't know for sure because we have not found inscriptions telling us what these figurines were. Here are some images of Mycenaean frescoes. As you can see, they're not as detailed or intricate as the Minoan frescoes. Women, when they're portrayed in Mycenaean frescoes, are portrayed with a lot more clothing and in a less sexual manner. They're also portrayed as not being as slender in Mycenaean frescoes, possibly to reflect the more warlike nature of the Mycenaean society. The Mycenaeans may have been emphasizing fertility over sexuality, or they may have been trying to show their women as being more muscular. Overall, though, the skill of the Mycenaean fresco artists seems to be lower, even though these frescoes are generally newer than the ones made by the Minoans. So seriation would not work as a form of relative dating when dating frescoes of the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. Here is a reconstructed fresco of Mycenaean women from Thebes. As you can see, there is a Minoan influence in Mycenaean 2D art and frescoes, but there are some slight differences as well. The women are portrayed in a little bit less revealing of a manner, and they're also portrayed with a little bit more full figures. Here's an example of a chariot scene displayed in a Mycenaean fresco. You'll see that the Mycenaean fresco artists depicted their males with darker skin, just like the Minoans did. Here you can see the chariot made of bronze, and you can see the helmets they're wearing as well. These helmets were usually made of pieces of boar tusk. Another example of Mycenaean frescoes of men. Instead of being portrayed jumping bulls or playing sports or fishing, Mycenaean males are portrayed in combat, reflecting the militaristic nature of Mycenaean society. Here are some images of Mycenaean arms and weapons. The images at the top were found in a Mycenaean tomb, and then the figure on the right is wearing a modern-day reproduction of bronze Mycenaean armor. The Mycenaeans primarily used bronze weapons, especially melee weapons like swords and spears. Kings and officers, the members of the elite classes, would have worn heavy bronze armor and a boar tusk helmet, as seen on the model on the left-hand side of the slide. They also would have worn crests on the top of their helmets. These crests would have made the wearers look taller and more intimidating, but they may have been a way to indicate rank as well. Enlisted warriors from the working classes probably did not wear armor like this. They probably only wore a much simpler boar tusk helmet and they might have had a shield made from leather and wood. Mycenaean warfare, because of its reliance on expensive bronze weapons, could have only worked in a stratified society, with a wealthy and well-armed and well-armored protected elite class, and then large numbers of lower-class recruits to serve as cannon fodder, or in ancient times, catapult fodder. Here's a vase from Athens showing Mycenaean warriors. You can see the boar tusk helmets, their spears, and then their shields in basic armor. These may be warriors from the upper class, based on their attire. Here are some modern artistic recreations of Mycenaean warriors. As you can see, the warriors of the elite class, with their crested helmets and their bronze armor, are much better protected than their working class subalterns, who just have helmets and shields. The Mycenaeans also used chariots as well, like the Egyptians and the ancient Near Eastern civilizations. With our background about the Mycenaean culture and the Mycenaean military in mind, I want to talk a little bit about the Trojan War, and then in some of the archaeological finds that have been made relating to Troy. Heinrich Schliemann, who investigated Mycenaean Greek sites, wanted to prove the veracity of the Trojan War, that it actually happened. A lot of people in the 1800s believed that the Trojan War was a purely fictional, purely mythical event, and Schliemann went out into the field of archaeology to prove that the Trojan War happened, that Troy was a real place. And he investigated the Hisarlik site. Hisar actually means fortress in Turkish. This area was controlled by the Ottoman Empire at the time. It's also a tell. In archaeology of the Near East, a tell is a reference to an artificial hill that's been developed by human use, basically multiple layers of human activity. Strata gets developed as buildings break down or are destroyed and are replaced. And by studying the Hisarlik site, we are able to confirm that Troy was a real place. The Trojan War probably took place between 1260 and 1180 BCE. Granted, there's a lot of mythology mixed in by Homer and other poets and bards who created the Iliad story in the 900s to 600s BCE. So it's a myth that's based on some decent historical evidence. The Hisarlik site is believed to be the historical place of Troy. We know that because we've found basically epigraphic or inscription evidence. We know that the Hittites called the site Tarusa or Walusa, which probably evolves into Troy or Ilium, terms used by the Greeks. And the Trojans were not Hittite or Greek. They may have been a people called the Luwians. The Luwians had some Indo-European ancestry, and this would explain why in the Homeric epics the struggle between the Trojans and the Greeks, it's portrayed as almost like a brother's quarrel, a very fratricidal conflict in which people who are related to each other and shouldn't be fighting each other are fighting each other. And that could be because of the shared Indo-European ancestry between the Luwians, who were at Troy, and the Greeks, who of course the Mycenaean Greeks have Indo-European heritage, at least in part. And there's good evidence that the Troy of the 1100s BCE was Luwian, because we found what is called the Luwian seal in the Troy site at that sort of strata period, that layer of human occupation. There's several layers of human occupation at Troy. In all likelihood, Troy was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times it was probably founded as early as 3600 BCE, and people were still living at Troy as late as 500 CE. And the period that would line up with when the Trojan War would have happened historically is Troy layers 6 through 7a. And there's evidence of warfare, fire, demolished buildings, and some exposed human remains. So this is the Hisarlik site is probably where Troy was. It's a site that was used for many years, destroyed and then rebuilt. Some of the destruction corresponds with when the Trojan War would have taken place historically. We believe that Hisarlik was called Tariusa or Walusa by the Hittites, and that's where the term Troy or Ilium comes from, terms used by the Greeks. And we also believe that the Trojans that were around at the time of the Trojan War that would have presumably fought the Greeks were themselves Luwians, suggesting they had some common ancestry with the Greeks. So there's good archaeological evidence to suggest that the Trojan War actually took place. Here are some scenes from the Trojan War. The Trojan War, according to Homer's myth, was fought over Helen of Sparta, who was betrothed to be married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Paris, the prince of Troy, kidnaps Helen with the help of the goddess Aphrodite. There's some debate over whether Helen went with Paris willingly or not. Here's some scenes from the war itself. Homer depicts the war as being highly destructive and fratricidal, with the Greeks fighting the Trojans for over 10 years. Important Greek heroes like Achilles fight in the war and ultimately are killed. The Trojan War ends when the Greeks build a horse, which they use to get inside the city. Then they open the gates to let their comrades in, and they destroy the city, putting its residents to the sword. I mentioned the Trojan War and its causes, the kidnapping of Helen, because some historians from the period, including Herodotus, mention that the kidnapping of women was very common in the ancient Aegean. Here's a map of the factions that took part in the Trojan War. Once again, highlighting that the Greeks were not a unified empire or unified under one government at this time, yet they had a strong sense of identity. Even as a separate confederation of city-states and principalities. The sacrifice of Iphigenia or Iphigenia was said to have taken place at the beginning of the Trojan War. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and leader of the Greek or Achaean coalition. Achaean is the term that Homer uses to describe the Greeks in the Iliad and the Odyssey. He had offended the goddess Artemis by killing a sacred stag, and in order to make Artemis happy again, he decided to sacrifice his daughter to her. There's many versions of the story. Artemis supposedly had given the Greeks unfavorable winds, preventing them from sailing to Troy, and Agamemnon needed to placate Artemis if the Greeks were to go to Troy by ship and to be successful. Some versions of the story have Iphigenia not being sacrificed at the last minute, surviving. Others have her being rescued by Artemis. Either way, what you see in these stories is that the ancient Greeks were aware of human sacrifice, and that occasionally their leaders engaged in human sacrifice, but it was considered to be a very dishonorable thing to do, a very desperate thing to do, not something that you did lightly and not a good thing. Agamemnon, for sacrificing his daughter, is actually going to be killed by his wife, Clytemnestra. There is some historical and archaeological evidence for the ancient Greeks or the Bronze Age Greeks practicing human sacrifice. This is the skull of Chania found on the island of Crete. It dates to about the 1280s BCE. This is during the Mycenaeans' rule of Crete, after the Minoan civilization had basically collapsed. Archaeologists and other scholars believe that this skull belonged to a sacrificial victim. This skull would have come from probably about an 8-year-old girl who's died from a very traumatic blow to the head. Not the sort of thing that would happen typically by accident, leading some to think that she had been sacrificed, killed with a blow to the head. Also, the fact that the body, the remains, were found with animal bones, possibly as animals that were sacrificed, lead archaeologists to think that this was evidence of sacrifice of humans amongst the Bronze Age Greeks. And based on this site, based on the state of these remains, it's very easy to see why the ancient Greeks saw human sacrifice as a barbaric practice. One, you're murdering another human being to placate the gods, and two, the ritual of bludgeoning someone in the head to kill them certainly is a very bloody thing. With this discussion about human sacrifice out of the way, we'll continue our discussion of the Trojan War and historical and archaeological evidence for this conflict. From an archaeological perspective, the Trojan War may also have taken place because Troy was in a very strategic location, close to the Dardanelles, also known as the Hellespont. This is a very strategic location nowadays, near the modern city of Istanbul, also known as Constantinople. Whoever controlled this strip of land could have controlled the Hellespont, and thus would have had very easy trade access to both Europe and Asia. As I mentioned before, this is a very strategic part of the world even today. Not so much because of trade, but because of access between the Aegean and the Black Sea. These are some illustrations of the layers of strata and human development at the Troy/Hisarlik site. Archaeologists think that the Trojan War would have taken place in layers Troy 6 and Troy 7A, shown here at the top. Here's an artist's recreation of what each of the layers would have looked like. As you can see, Troy evolves from a small settlement into a much larger city over time. The image on the left-hand side of this slide shows the various layers of strata at the Troy site. Here you can see Roman numeral 3 for Troy 3 and Roman numeral 4 for Troy 4. You can also see Troy 2 down lower because it's an older layer. Here is a map of the ruins of Troy with the various layers marked in color. As you can see, the Trojan War would have taken place somewhere towards the end of Troy 6 and during Troy 7A. This map also shows that Troy was inhabited for centuries after the destruction of Troy during the Trojan War. We can see a theater and baths from the Roman period. Here are some archaeological reconstructions of the foundations of some of the buildings at Troy. As you can see, the Trojans used a variety of stone masonry to build their buildings, similar to the Mycenaeans, suggesting a sharing of ideas as well. This marble building over here seems to have a Near Eastern or Mesopotamian influence, suggesting they were taking ideas from the East as well as the West. Here's an artist's rendering of what Troy may have looked like at about the time of the Trojan War. We can see the vivid colors of the buildings perhaps inspired by the Minoans. But there also seems to be a Near Eastern influence in the architecture as well, as I described on a previous slide. Once again, this is an artist's rendering. It's an estimate of what the city may have looked like. Now we'll discuss a little bit of information about the excavation of Troy and why Heinrich Schliemann is a very controversial figure in archaeological history. As I mentioned before, Schliemann investigated the Troy/Hisarlik site because he wanted to prove the validity of the Homeric myths, specifically the Iliad. From 1871 to 1875 of the Common Era, Schliemann and his team worked very quickly and carelessly, even using dynamite to blast through the layers of strata to get to the level where they thought that the Troy of the Trojan War would be. Keep in mind that the field of archaeology was still professionalizing at this time, so things like this were a little bit more imaginable. Still, Schliemann's activities never escalated to the levels seen in the Indiana Jones films or similar media. Schliemann found many valuable artifacts, including gold and silver, jewelry, which he then smuggled out of Turkey and took back to Greece. Turkey at the time was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, but Greece was not. Here are some of the artifacts found by Schliemann and his team at Troy. They recovered many artifacts, simple things like pots, but they also recovered very expensive jewelry, what was labeled Priam's treasure. Priam was the king of Troy at the time of the Trojan War, according to the Homeric myths. Here you can see Schliemann's wife, Sophia, modeling some of the jewelry. By the way, Schliemann's wife was Greek. More recent archaeologists argue that Schliemann may have mixed periods of strata, probably because he used dynamite, and some of the artifacts he found may be older than Troy 6. This is, of course, why professional archaeologists don't use dynamite when they're excavating an archaeological site, why they work very carefully and painstakingly. Now that we've discussed the Trojan War, we should talk about Mycenaean burial rituals and tombs. The Mycenaean upper classes would have had their remains interred in tholos tombs. These were large monumental tombs shaped like beehives and made out of earth and masonry. While these tombs are large enough to be considered monumental, they're much smaller than the pyramids or the tombs of the Valley of the Kings. In general, the ancient Greeks did not spend as much time building large tombs for themselves as other civilizations did. But the Mycenaeans are a little bit of an exception. Their upper class build tombs that are somewhat large, but still nothing compared to what the Egyptians were doing. Here's an interior view of the Tholos tomb. As you can see from the bricks, they're parallel with the ground. This is a corbel dome. It's not a true architectural dome because these bricks are parallel with the ground. It's still very architecturally impressive, though. Some archaeologists think that the walls of these tombs may have been covered with pure gold, although we don't know that for sure. And most of the Tholos tombs were robbed not long after their construction. Here's an example of a smaller Tholos tomb. This is another image of a Tholos tomb with a human here to show the scale of these tombs. They're very large, but they're not nearly as large as the pyramids or the tombs of the Valley of the Kings. In terms of their burial customs, the Mycenaeans are most known for their death masks. These death masks are made of gold, and the level of craftsmanship to make them, even simpler ones, would have been very sophisticated. So it shows social stratification. They're spending money on these burial goods. These burial goods would have been for wealthier people like kings. It shows sophistication with making these death masks. Very skilled artisans would have made them. Basically, the artisans would have placed a thin piece of a thin sheet of gold over like a log or something like that, and then they would chisel the facial features of the person they were making the death mask for. Some, like the so-called Mask of Agamemnon, are very realistic, very lifelike. Others are not quite as good of workmanship. This probably would have been based on the skill of the artisan, but also the amount that the person who's commissioning the mask was willing to pay. A wealthier king would have had a death mask like this one. Perhaps a less wealthy, less powerful king would have had a mask like this one. And the Mycenaeans buried their dead, their elite dead, with other grave goods, including weapons, highlighting the militarism of their culture. And it also shows that the Mycenaeans had some belief in the afterlife, that the dead would need weapons in the afterlife. They would need grave goods in the afterlife. And the examples of death masks that we have on this slide, they come from about the 1600s BCE. So if Agamemnon were a historical figure, they're about 400 years or so too early for Agamemnon. These are about 400 years from before Agamemnon would have lived. Now we have to talk about the end of the Mycenaean civilization. About the year 1050 or so BCE, a people called the Dorians began to invade or migrate into Mycenaean territory. They basically came, we think, from the Pontic steppes. They may have been a later Indo-European people, and they worked their way through western Greece all the way down to the Peloponnesian Peninsula. They seem to have been a semi-nomadic equestrian people. We think that they rode horses rather than used chariots. We think that they used iron weapons. Knowledge of iron existed in other places, but it seems the Dorians had a better understanding of iron than other cultures around them, which allowed them to be very militarily successful. Iron is easier and cheaper to make once you master, once you can make furnaces that are hot enough to smelt and create, make iron out of iron ore. And by this point, the Mycenaeans just may have been too weak and too worn out to resist these invading Dorians. Previous military conflicts like the Trojan War, a century or so earlier, may have just weakened Mycenaean society, even though they won that conflict, based on the damage that was done to the Troy site. And it's possible that everyday Mycenaean Greeks, people who did not live in the citadels, who did not benefit from the redistributive economy, they may have been tired of their Mycenaean warlords, and they may have refused to fight and be cannon fodder for the Mycenaean kings. They also may have even perhaps joined some of the Dorian invaders. It's possible that foot soldiers with their new iron weapons, they were developing new tactics to basically defeat the Mycenaean elite who were using chariots. We think that the Mycenaeans used chariots in warfare, but they probably did not use them in large massed assaults the way like the Egyptians or the Hittites did. They probably used chariots here and there, almost like tanks in the Second World War. But then we think that the infantry may have figured out how to kind of separate the chariots from their support troops and then basically take the chariots out. Kind of like how in the Second World War, soldiers learned how to eventually destroy tanks using new technology. And I bring this up because I've compared tanks and chariots before. Basically, chariots were the tanks of old world militaries. To make matters worse for the Mycenaean civilization as it's collapsing, They're facing raids from the Dorians. Their own people are rising up against them. They also may have been having attacks from the sea from a group of pirates called the Sea People. And the Sea People, we don't exactly know who they were or where they were from. They were probably a multi-ethnic culture, or people of many different groups coming together who would basically get on ships and raid across the Eastern Mediterranean. So the Sea People may have been attacking from the coast. The Dorians may have been attacking from the north. And all of these external pressures combined with internal pressures, social stratification, being worn out from the Trojan Wars, the poor of Mycenaean society refusing to fight, maybe even helping the invaders, all of these things will lead the Mycenaean civilization, this Bronze Age culture, to come to an end. And in its stead, you'll have what is called the Greek Iron Age or the Greek Dark Age. And the Greek Iron Age, the Greek Dark Age, will last until the beginning of the Archaic period. And there's not a lot of monumental archaeological evidence. There's not a lot of buildings and things being built during this period. We think that it was a period of turmoil and strife. That doesn't mean that there were not cultural achievements, though, for the Greeks during the Dark Age. And we'll talk about the Greek Dark Age in a few minutes. This is a ceramic kylix, basically a wine cup, that shows a hippias or a cavalryman. Perhaps this is a Dorian cavalryman. We think that the Dorians were equestrian raiders that rode on horseback and basically were able to overwhelm the Mycenaeans. This kylix is not from the Dark Age, it's from later. But it's useful for illustrative purposes. And this is a modern image of an attack of Sea People. Basically, the Dorians are attacking by land, and the Sea People are attacking by sea. And these attackers, combined with internal problems the Mycenaeans are dealing with, lead to the Bronze Age Greek culture of the Mycenaeans coming to an end, and the Dark Age or Iron Age beginning. Now we should discuss the Greek Dark Age, so-called. Was it really a Dark Age? This period, from about 1050 into the 800s BCE, was certainly chaotic. It was part of the Bronze Age collapse, experienced across the Near East, in which many civilizations struggled or collapsed. New military technology, including iron weapons and lances and mounted cavalry, may have helped the Dorians collapse the Mycenaean civilization. Previous civilizations in the ancient Near East and Greece had relied on chariots, but men mounted on larger horses would have been much more maneuverable and also much cheaper to maintain in the field than multiple horses pulling one chariot. The chaos of this period may have inspired Homer's epic poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey. Greek polytheism, as we know it, probably emerged during this so-called Dark Age as well. The instability on the Greek mainland would have inspired the creation of Greek colonies, settlements across the Mediterranean basin. This probably occurred around the 900s BCE. And the Greeks, in the setup of these settlements, would have spread their culture throughout the Mediterranean, throughout North Africa, the Black Sea, and even as far as Italy, the southern coast of what is now France and Spain as well. During this period, the Greeks moved away from the Mycenaean linear B writing system and developed the Greek alphabet, which is still in use today and has formed the basis for many other alphabets, including the Roman alphabet, which we use in English. As such, it's probably best not to call this period the Dark Ages, just because we don't know very much about it. It's not necessarily a bad time in Greek history. It's best to probably refer to this period as the Early Iron Age, or the Pre-Archaic period. Now we'll look at some Iron Age and pre-archaic Greek art. A lot of the art in this period is called geometric art, leading some scholars to call the Greek Dark Age, so-called the geometric period. And you can see the very clear geometric patterns on these examples of Greek pottery from the period. Here's another example of Greek geometric period pottery. You can see the human figures are very simple, consisting of triangles and circles. There is some slight similarity to the older Minoan and Mycenaean art in the sense that these human figures have very narrow waists, but as you can see, it's very different than the art from earlier periods. They're very focused on geometric patterns. Also, you can see scenes from warfare here on the bottom section of this piece of pottery. There's chariots and soldiers bearing shields as well. Here are some geometric bronze figurines. This is a centaur shown here. The centaurs were half human, half horse, and here is a horse figurine. Horses, of course, would have been very valuable to the Greeks really throughout their entire history. Horses are a form of transportation. They are used in warfare. They can pull chariots. They can be ridden into combat. Horses also can be used to pull plows for agriculture, a very valuable commodity. So it's not surprising that horses show up in a variety of types of Greek art. By the way, these figurines come from the 8th century BCE, so towards the end of the Greek Dark Age and at sort of the beginning of the Greek Archaic period. And both of these pieces also are housed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Conclusion. The Bronze Age and early Iron Age Greek civilizations shared some important similarities, but also some important differences as well. They used an Indo-European language that would evolve into Greek. They also used writing systems, linear A, linear B, and then the Greek alphabet that we know today. During this period, the Bronze Age and the early Iron Age, there was trade of both goods and ideas. Trade by sea and travel by sea would become a defining part of Greek culture. We also saw that some of these societies, especially the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, were very stratified, with a large working and peasant class providing labor and food for a much smaller elite class. We see the Greeks' preference for stone architecture in the construction of their palaces and citadels and tombs. We also see an influence of Near Eastern artwork and North African artwork in the art of the Greek cultures during this period. The Greeks buried their bodies rather than cremating or mummifying them. They buried them in tombs that were much smaller than those used by the Egyptians, called tholos tombs. Warfare was a major part of life during the Bronze Age and early Iron Age, as seen during the Mycenaean invasion of Crete, the Trojan War, and the Dorian invasion. The Greek alphabet, colonization, and Greek epic poetry, as seen by the work of Homer, emerged as a result of these cultural patterns during the Bronze Age and the early Iron Age. While not unified under a single government or empire, the Greeks developed a strong cultural identity as a result of their ancestors' achievements and trials during the Bronze Age and the early Iron Age. We'll talk more about how these developments influenced Greek civilization in later videos.